Hello and welcome to Bitcoin Explained. In this video, I'll be making the case for Bitcoin in 2025. The reason that I'm recording this video is that recently I've had a lot of friends and family reach out to me asking questions about Bitcoin and about the investment thesis for Bitcoin. So instead of sitting down with everybody one-on-one and going through what I'm about to share with you, I've decided to record this video which I can share with you and you can pass on to anybody else who you think might benefit from this, to really help explain how Bitcoin fits into the evolution of money and what the case for Bitcoin as an emergent store of value in an increasingly digital and global world is. Now, this is not a video that necessarily explains Bitcoin or the blockchain in detail, because I don't think that that's really required to understand the investment case for Bitcoin. I will touch upon this briefly, but this is not an explainer of the technical aspects of Bitcoin. Now, with all that said, let's talk about the case for Bitcoin in 2025. Before I get started with the presentation, just for reference, today is the 31st of January 2025. The current block height is 881,577 with a Bitcoin price of $104,628 US dollars. Now, in today's presentation, I'll be splitting it up into 8 sections. First, I'll talk about what happened in the Bitcoin space in 2024, because last year was a really big year and a really transformative year for Bitcoin. Then I'll explain Bitcoin in a nutshell and move on to how we even got to Bitcoin. Then I'll make the case for Bitcoin as a monetary good or store of value, and then talk about Bitcoin's adoption trajectory. I'll then talk about Bitcoin's role in the portfolio, and then move on to contrasting Bitcoin and crypto and why it's so important to distinguish between the two. Finally, I will then address some of the common questions and concerns. All right, with that, let's talk about what happened in the Bitcoin space in 2024. So the first big category of changes of 2024 is the institutional adoption and Wall Street. These are all just headlines that I'm about to show, but BlackRock's IBIT spot Bitcoin ETF actually became the last decade's top performing ETF for inflows, surpassing over 2,850 other ETFs. This here is a chart of the cumulative inflows into the Bitcoin ETF up until December of 2024. We also saw a pension fund in the UK make an investment into Bitcoin, combined with the Wisconsin pension fund in the US investing more than 160 million in the Bitcoin ETF between January and April of 2024 alone. The University of Michigan endowment increased its crypto investments, meaning its investment in Bitcoin, and followed suit to what Harvard and Yale had already done in the US. MicroStrategy at the end of 2024 was included in the Nasdaq 100, which is also pretty big. Nation-state sentiment changes. So the biggest one probably is the proposed Bitcoin Act of 2024, a bill proposing a US strategic Bitcoin reserve in the US by Senator Lummis. Then in December, or I think it was November last year actually, Russia launched the BRICS mining infrastructure project, where they provide the infrastructure and the equipment to mine Bitcoin to other BRICS nations, which have started using some of their government resources to mine Bitcoin actually. Bitcoin mining also aided in grid stabilization in Texas and harnessed wasted renewable energy in Japan. Jerome Powell, at the beginning of December 2024, compared Bitcoin to gold and said that it was a competitor to gold and downplayed the threat to the US dollar. And on Boxing Day, so December 26th of 2024, Russia actually announced that it's using Bitcoin in foreign trade, according to their finance minister. And this is something from early of 2025, but I think I just have to mention this. The Czech central bank had wants to buy billions of euros in Bitcoin, and they're currently making a decision on this. In terms of regulatory changes, one of the key changes that we've seen last year is the FASB accounting rule changes, which now allow for fair value accounting. Why is this important? So previously, companies had to account for crypto, including Bitcoin, as indefinite lived intangible assets on their balance sheet, meaning they could only mark them down, not up, unless they sold them. Now they can report them at the current market value, which removes a big hurdle of corporate adoption and likely leads to more companies following MicroStrategy's lead. Now, yesterday, as I'm recording this, Tesla actually released their quarterly earnings, and if I remember correctly off the top of my head, I think somewhere around 27% of their earnings for Q4 of 2024 were due to their Bitcoin holdings because of this exact accounting rule change. Now, another big change is that BNY Mellon got the green light to offer Bitcoin custody services last year. The SEC also approved BlackRock's spot Bitcoin ETF options listing. This is a really significant step towards recognizing Bitcoin as an investment vehicle suitable for traditional markets because it allows investors, particularly large institutions, to hedge, speculate, or gain exposure to Bitcoin's price movement in alternative ways. And it signifies a step towards the maturation of the Bitcoin market by providing mechanisms for risk management that are standard in traditional finance. Now, the last change is also something from early 2025, which is that the SEC rescinded SAB 121, freeing banks to provide digital asset custody. Previously, banks were required to treat digital assets that they held on behalf of their clients as liabilities on their balance sheet, which imposed really stringent capital requirements and increased operational costs, essentially making it unfeasible for banks to offer custody services. With this SAB 121 now being rescinded, banks can treat Bitcoin and other digital assets like traditional assets held in custody, leading to the potential for new financial products such as Bitcoin-backed products or people borrowing against their Bitcoin and so on. So to summarize, institutions and governments all over the world are taking steps to incorporate Bitcoin. Bitcoin's regulatory landscape has evolved a lot and is turning very pro-Bitcoin, not just in the US, even in the BRICS nations. The infrastructure around Bitcoin is maturing, so custody by banks is now becoming possible. We have the ETFs and the options, and companies are looking at putting this on their balance sheet more and following MicroStrategy's suit. So the scale of adoption, legal clarity, and technical strides since 2024 have irrevocably changed Bitcoin's investment profile. Today's Bitcoin demands a completely fresh perspective. Its role, reliability, and upside potential are nothing like they were even a year ago. Bitcoin today is not the same Bitcoin that it was just 1 year ago, let alone 2, 3, 4, or 5 years ago. Now that we've seen how the Bitcoin space has evolved just in the last year, let's look at Bitcoin in a nutshell. What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a global, decentralized, censorship-resistant protocol for storing and transferring value without the need for trusted third party. If you truly understand what this sentence and every word in it means, and you can explain it in your own words, then I would argue you understand Bitcoin well enough. Bitcoin is also digital scarcity, which is protected by proof of work and the blockchain. In order to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm just quickly going to go through each of the key properties of Bitcoin and explain what they mean. So the first one is that Bitcoin is decentralized. This means that no one controls Bitcoin and it's maintained by a distributed network of computers or nodes. It's trustless, meaning no central party needs to be trusted. The protocol's rules ensure valid transaction without relying on human honesty. What's important to understand here is that not only do you not need to trust a central party, you also don't have to trust any other participant in the network. They either act honestly or get rejected by the consensus rules and waste money. Bitcoin is peer-to-peer, meaning users transact directly with each other, which leads to faster, more efficient transfers, especially if you think about finality of transactions. Bitcoin is censorship resistant, meaning that no one can block or censor users or transactions. It's absolutely scarce. It has a hard cap of 21 million. It's immutable, meaning that once a transaction or block is added, it can't be changed. It's global, meaning it's accessible to anyone with an internet connection and allows for easy cross-border value transfer. It doesn't matter if you're in Africa, in America, in a small town or a big city. As long as you have access to the internet, you have access to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is also secure. It's protected by unbreakable cryptography and secured through proof of work, which requires energy and computation. It's verifiable. Anyone can easily and independently verify and audit the entire transaction history and therefore the ownership record of Bitcoin. It's digital, meaning Bitcoin is digitally native. It exists purely in electronic form. Now, to explain the supply schedule and the hard cap of 21 million a little bit more, what I'm showing here is a graph of the supply schedule, meaning the black line here represents the outstanding or already mined Bitcoin supply, and the yellow line just represents the block subsidy, which has its y-axis on the right-hand side of this graph. But what you can see as at 2025, we have almost mined 20 million out of the 21 million Bitcoin to ever be mined, and the current block reward that miners get for adding a block to the blockchain is 3.125 Bitcoin. Now, arguably one of the biggest breakthroughs of Bitcoin is that it introduced digital scarcity for the first time. Previously, anything digital, whether it's images, text, or music, could be copied many times over at practically zero cost. But this led to the double spend problem, and without a central authority, there was no way to solve the double spend problem in a digital realm prior to Bitcoin. So in the digital world, information can be copied and pasted infinitely. And without a reliable mechanism to ensure a digital coin isn't spent twice, counterfeit duplicates of this coin can circulate endlessly. And in the digital world, everything is essentially just ones and zeros, or information, but sharing information duplicates it. So in the physical world, for example, if I have some information and I share it with you, then we both have that information. But cash, for example, if we have that in the physical world, then if I give you a $10 note, then I don't have it anymore and you have it. And what we needed to do in the digital world to recreate something like this is to create something that replicates how cash works in the physical world, but in a digital realm, in a realm of information only and no physicality to what's being transacted. Now, Satoshi Nakamoto combined existing ideas in cryptography and networking with the novel concept of a blockchain to track and immutably verify every Bitcoin transaction across a global network. The blockchain is what's the enforcer of truth and scarcity in this case. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive on how the blockchain works, but what you essentially just need to know is that it's a shared public ledger, meaning that every node running Bitcoin software keeps a full copy of the entire blockchain, a chain of blocks that contain all valid transactions since Bitcoin began in 2009. Nodes follow the consensus rules, meaning that they verify that each new block follows the core rules, including who owns which Bitcoin, that coins aren't spent more than once, and that the total supply can never exceed 21 million. It's immutable via proof of work, meaning that miners expend real energy to compete for the right to add the next block, making it near impossible to alter past blocks. Now I'm saying near impossible here because technically it's possible, but we're at a point where the hash rate has become so high and this has become so secure that it's basically impossible to do this. So to recap, digital scarcity did not exist prior to Bitcoin in any verifiable, trustless way. And the blockchain is the linchpin that ensures nobody can forge, copy, or counterfeit Bitcoin. And you can think of the blockchain kind of like a distributed time-stamped ledger, which is why some people in the Bitcoin space refer to it as a time chain as well. All right, before we move on to Bitcoin as a store of value, I want to take some time to talk about how we even got to Bitcoin and how it fits into the evolution of money. So this is a bit simplified, but essentially the evolution of money looked something like this. So we started off with barter, then moved on to primitive forms of money or collectibles. From there we moved on to precious metals, then to gold-backed certificates, and now we currently are at fiat money. Now gold-backed certificates and fiat money are the only forms of money that we've had so far that are government issued. And then of course the question mark here is whether Bitcoin is the next step in this evolution of money. Now one thing that's really important to understand here is that, as I've highlighted, only these two forms of money are government issued, and money in and of itself is not something that has to be issued by the government. Money usually emerges naturally as human societies continually look for more efficient ways to trade, and over time they converge on the good that best fulfills the roles of money. And economists often define money as the most saleable or tradable good, the item that is easiest to exchange for anything else. It emerges out of practical necessity and market consensus rather than by top-down design. Another thing that's important is that in each iteration in the evolution of money, we improved on some of the shortcomings of the previous form of money. So for barter, for example, barter required the double coincidence of wants and was hard to standardize. Meaning if I had bread and you had eggs and I wanted your eggs, then that trade would only work if you also want bread. But if you want apples instead, then I first have to find someone who's willing to give me apples for my bread to then exchange those apples for your eggs. You can see how once we move into large groups of societies, this becomes really inefficient and basically impossible. Collectibles were more universally accepted. They were also rare and culturally recognized and became the earliest forms of store of value that we used. But collectibles weren't scarce enough and could easily be inflated with better technology. This actually happened many times throughout history when European settlers discovered new lands where less technologically advanced societies were using collectibles as money that the Europeans could gather or create more efficiently. One example where this happened was the use of glass beads as a form of money in Africa. So certain regions in Africa were using glass beads as a form of wealth, store of value, and as a money as well, because long before Europeans arrived there for the first time, North African and Middle Eastern traders sometimes brought these glass beads down to Africa, which were really rare and highly prized, and people used it really to store their wealth and to exchange and trade it for goods and services. Once the European settlers discovered these societies in Africa that were using glass beads, and when the European glass-making centers were flourishing, especially in Venice at the time, factories in Venice could produce these exact glass beads in huge quantities and standardized forms for really, really cheap, and they were then able to flood the market in Africa with these glass beads that were produced at quantity, and thereby appropriate a lot of the goods and services of these African societies with this newly cheaply created glass beads. And the African societies, until they realized that this is what was going on, a lot of their goods had been bought away from them and appropriated from them, and they were left with worthless glass beads. Global trade also made stores of value from different societies compete, which led to gold emerging as the best store of value because it had the best properties and winning out in the end. And then at some point we ended up using silver for transactions and gold as a store of value because gold packed too much value into a small unit, so it was hard to use gold for small transactions. Now, gold was heavy, inconvenient to transport in large amounts, and difficult to divide into smaller units. So our solution to that problem was that we issued gold-backed certificates, which are far easier to transport, store, transact, and divide. But the problem with gold-backed certificates is that they require trust in the issuer to hold sufficient gold and honor redemptions. The rigid monetary supply, by having certificates backed by gold, limited the governments and central banks in their spending and flexibility to manage the economy. And we introduced fiat, or government decreed money, which removed the gold constraint and allowed for easier expansion or contraction of the money supply, but unlimited supply can lead to inflation or currency debasement and requires deep trust. Now, Bitcoin introduces digital scarcity, as we talked about, decentralization, censorship resistance, and trustless global value transfer. It seeks to combine the best traits of gold's scarcity with the portability and divisibility of fiat without needing centralized issuers. So essentially, Satoshi realized that gold had a lot of benefits that fiat didn't have, the scarcity and being controlled by no one, but it lacked the portability, divisibility, and easy verifiability required to stay money in an increasingly globalized world where information, and therefore trade, can travel at the speed of light. He also realized that fiat improved upon these shortcomings but sacrificed some of the key properties of gold as a result. So his solution was something that combined the best properties of both. Okay, now that we understand how Bitcoin fits into the evolution of money, let's quickly look at what money actually is and what functions an ideal money should serve. So the ideal money should basically fulfill three functions. It should be a medium of exchange, meaning it's widely accepted as payment for goods and services. It should also be a unit of account, meaning that goods and services are priced in it. And it should also be a store of value, meaning that it retains purchasing power over time. You can save the money and later buy roughly the same amount of goods and services. Now, gold actually used to fulfill all of these, but ran into issues of portability, divisibility, and verifiability at some point. What I'm showing here are some examples of forms of money that fit into the different categories. Now, what I've got down here, the Turkish lira and Nigerian naira and the Argentinian peso, for example. The reason why I'm only showing them under medium of exchange is that in countries with dysfunctional states or hyperinflating currencies, you often have one good that fulfills the role of medium of exchange, while another good fills the role of unit of account. So in Argentina, for example, the peso is used as a medium of exchange, but the US dollar is used as a short-term or medium-term store of value and a unit of account. Now, you could argue though that in any country with a somewhat functional state and non-hyperinflating currency, fiat money is never used as a store of value. And we have now moved on to using other things to store our value, such as shares, property, gold, or art, and other collectibles. So looking at these three different functions of money, where Bitcoin fits in best at the moment is as an emergent store of value in an increasingly digital world. And this is the most compelling investment thesis for Bitcoin at the moment as well. Looking at these other functions of money, one thing I want to highlight here is that I find that there's often too much of a focus on the medium of exchange role of Bitcoin, and people will criticize Bitcoin and say things like, well, but I can't buy my coffee with Bitcoin yet, which really misses the point because first of all, technologically speaking, Bitcoin can become a medium of exchange pretty easily using second layer solutions like the Lightning Network. But what's important to understand is that before something becomes a medium of exchange, it needs to be a stable store of value first. This becomes clear when you look at the 4 stages of monetization. Now, what's important to understand here is that these stages of monetization apply to money that emerges naturally in a free market competition by being selected by the people. This doesn't apply to currency, which the government essentially forces us to use. So to become a medium of exchange and a unit of account, it needs to become a store of value first. Let's quickly look at this. So usually what happens is an emergent money starts off as a collectible. Then once enough people collect something, it'll be recognized as a means of keeping and storing value, meaning that its purchasing power rises as more people demand it until it plateaus and is widely held. Once it's widely held and its purchasing power stabilizes, money can be used as a medium of exchange. But this may take decades or centuries. For gold, this took a very long time, but also because the world wasn't as global as it is now. Once a money is a medium of exchange and is widely used as a medium of exchange, goods will be priced in it, and this will usually happen pretty quickly after it becomes a medium of exchange. So once again, where we currently are most likely is Bitcoin moving from being a collectible to a store of value. And just to reiterate the point from previously, an emergent store of value in an increasingly digital world is the most compelling investment thesis for Bitcoin in 2025. Now, before moving on to explaining Bitcoin's case as a monetary good and store of value, I quickly want to highlight why fiat money is not a good store of value. Now, this here is a chart of the erosion of purchasing power of the strongest of the fiat currencies, the US dollar, which shows that in the last 100 years, a US dollar has lost roughly 96 to 97% of its purchasing power. Now, there are a few events that are highlighted along this chart here, which I think are important to understand. I'm not going to do too long of a history lesson here, but the first thing that's important to understand is that in 1933, what happened was that President Roosevelt, through Executive Order 6102, criminalized the private possession of gold and essentially seized all of the gold of US citizens and then devalued the dollar against gold around 40% overnight. Then in 1944, following World War II, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement, where I think it was around 40 heads of different states all over the world came together in a town called Bretton Woods to agree on this agreement, which basically established a gold standard, and the US dollar would be used as the world's reserve currency. What that means is that the US dollar would be backed by gold, and every other country would back their currency with US dollars, knowing that they could always take their dollars to the US and exchange them for gold. But this also meant that the US ended up holding a lot of gold for other countries, and those countries were required to trust the US not to print more dollars than the gold that they were holding. Then fast forward to 1971, the US had been fighting the Vietnam War for a lot longer than expected, and they also ended up spending way more money than they anticipated. But they were financing some of this war expense by printing new dollars. But they weren't backing those dollars with the equivalent amount of gold. And a lot of the countries that agreed to the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 became a bit suspicious of this. And the first country to try to call them out on this was the French government, which went over to the US with their US dollars and asked for their gold back, at which point President Nixon at the time told them that he was temporarily ending the convertibility of US dollars to gold. Now, this temporary pause of the convertibility is lasting up until today. So from 1971 onwards, the US dollar and any other currency hasn't been backed by gold anymore. Then following the GFC in 2008, we had the first big round of quantitative easing, and this chart only goes up to 2020, which is when COVID happened, and just in 2020 alone, the US printed roughly 20% of all dollars ever created. Now, I think up until today, I've seen different numbers, but I think it's somewhere around 40% of all dollars that were ever created were created since COVID. Now, this really shows why fiat money has not been a good store of value anymore. And historically, if you actually run the numbers for all of the developed countries over the last, I think, around 60 or 70 years, the money supply has increased by somewhere between 7 and 8% per year, meaning that every dollar or euro or yen or Australian dollar that you held in your bank account or that you held under your mattress at home in cash was losing 7 to 8% of its purchasing power. Now, you might say, okay, but I'm getting a bit of interest on that, but you most likely weren't getting 7 to 8% of interest. So the longer you held your fiat money, the less goods and services it was able to buy you. Now, we have already covered how Bitcoin fits into the evolution of money and its role as a monetary good. Let's focus on the store of value aspect now. The first thing that I want to explain here is something that's slightly abstract, but I think really helpful to understand. In an abstract way, you can think of money as economic energy, where money is viewed as stored work or stored productivity. Under this lens, how you can view it is that you expend your time, effort, skills, or expertise to earn money. That money represents the value of your expended energy, and you can then later use that energy, now represented as money, to buy other people's time, effort, or skills. Let's look at an example of what this might look like. So in this example, I'm using a surgeon who is exchanging his time, effort, skills, and expertise for money. In this case, I'm just assuming that he makes $400 per hour. And then he later wants to use that money to take his wife out for a nice, high-quality dinner date, which costs, let's say, $200 per date because they're getting some nice food with a good bottle of wine. So what's the economic energy that the surgeon provides here that he then stores in money to later exchange as other economic energy? And what's that other economic energy? For the surgeon, skills and expertise are arguably the greatest energy contribution. He has a lot of specialized training, years of education, ongoing practice, honed dexterity, judgment under pressure, and the responsibility of operating on someone's body. This energy is what society, patients, and hospitals are paying for when they compensate him with $400 an hour. He then stores that in some form of money. In this case, I'm using fiat currency here. And he can then exchange a fraction of his previously exchanged energy for the restaurant staff's time and effort. So the chefs preparing the food, the servers attending to customers, and hosts managing the seating. All of these people invest their time and labor into the dining experience. So that's the restaurant's specialized form of energy. In a way, the dinner date is not just a meal, but it's a bundle of other people's time, effort, skills, and expertise. So at the moment, the surgeon knows that he can exchange half an hour of his economic energy through performing surgery to a nice dinner date with his wife. So the surgeon knows half an hour of surgery is equal to one high quality dinner with my wife. But the surgeon likely doesn't spend all of his money on dinner dates or other things straight away. He probably wants to put some of his money away into savings so that he can use his stored economic energy later in life. And with a good savings technology, he should be able to exchange his stored half an hour of economic energy or half an hour of surgery for the same quality dinner experience that he can get with half an hour of his energy today, even if it's in 5 or 10 years. But the problem with that is that in 5 years, the same quality dinner date with his wife might cost $300 instead of $200 due to inflation. And even if he gets a few percent interest on his stored energy in the bank, that won't be able to maintain the purchasing power of his economic energy. So what does he do? What he does is he tries to find a battery that stores his economic energy in a way that maintains purchasing power into the future. Now, notice a few things about this slide. The surgeon now performs the surgery in 2025, but he expects half an hour of his economic energy to buy him one quality date with his wife in 2035, so 10 years later. Another thing that I've changed here is that instead of thinking of dollar amounts, we are now thinking in terms of contributions. This lens clarifies that what we really exchange with money are contributions, our time, effort, skill set, expertise, and even creative abilities. Money is simply how we package and carry that contribution from person to person, place to place, or across time. So instead of fiat money, we are now thinking of a battery or a container that stores the economic energy the best in a way where it retains its purchasing power over time. So instead of storing the value of his economic energy in a currency that gets diluted over time, I previously talked about the 7 to 8% per year for developed countries, the surgeon seeks out other batteries for his economic energy. Now, up until now, we only focused on the leak-proof property of an ideal store of value. but there are many other properties that the truly ideal store of value or battery would need to have, especially in an increasingly global and digital world. So what are the ideal properties for this battery? Now, one thing that's really powerful here is to go through a little thought experiment. And the thought experiment is the following. If you could design the ideal store of value, what properties would it have? If you want, you can pause the video here and think about this for a couple of minutes yourself. I will move on now, so if you want to pause, press pause now. And what I'm about to show you on the next slide is based on a list of properties that a German investment advisor who I follow closely, who has done this exact exercise with dozens of family offices in Germany and Europe, has collected. And the list of the properties of an ideal store of value is the following. There should be no inflation possible, so no dilution of your stored wealth and purchasing power. It should be divisible, liquid, portable, sendable. It should have no or low cost of storage, no access by third parties. No one should control it. It should be accessible anywhere in the world. It should be durable, verifiable, have unlimited capacity. This means that storing $10 or $100 billion in this ideal store of value should be equally possible. It should have egalitarian rules, meaning that no one gets special rules, access, or privileges, irrespective of the amount that they invest. It should have finality of transactions, be unforgeable, fungible, and should have an established history. Now, if we actually rate different stores of value that we currently use, fiat money and Bitcoin, on all of these properties, then what becomes clear from a first principles analysis is that Bitcoin clearly outperforms every other asset on the ideal properties of a store of value, apart from the track record, which you can see down here because Bitcoin is only 16 years old as of the time of this recording. Now, another thing that's interesting to see here is that gold and fiat actually complement each other in certain areas quite well, which is probably why gold-backed certificates were the best solution that we had thus far. Another thing that's really interesting, and this will be interesting to people in Australia, which is where I live, where property is probably the most widely used store of value, is that from a first principles analysis, property is actually quite an undesirable store of value. The reason for that is that if you look at the properties which we listed as the properties that an ideal store of value should have from a first principles perspective, a house or a property is not divisible. It's also highly illiquid. It takes really long times to sell properties usually, and there's really big transaction costs and a lot of work involved in that. They are immobile, so completely not portable. They're not sendable. They have really high costs of storage. Access by third parties is also relatively easy. They can be seized, which happens in certain countries sometimes, and they're not accessible anywhere. They also don't have unlimited capacity because you can't invest $10 or $20 into a property, and investing really large amounts into a property also really increases their management costs. They don't have egalitarian rules because a lot of people are being priced out of the housing market, and a property is not fungible, meaning that one property is not equal to another property, whereas 1 ounce of gold is exactly the same as another ounce of gold, or 1 Bitcoin is the same as another Bitcoin. There are a few exceptions to this where Bitcoin or a part of a Bitcoin or Satoshis could be flagged because they were involved in illegal activity or something like that, and then some exchanges might not accept it, but leaving that aside, 1 Bitcoin is equal to another Bitcoin. Now for gold, obviously, as we've previously talked about, it's not easily portable, it's not easily sendable, and it has pretty high costs of storage. For shares, no inflation possible. Well, companies can always issue more shares. They're also not easily divisible because usually you have to buy a full share. No access by third parties is also not guaranteed, and no one controls it is obviously not the case because the company who is able to issue these shares controls it fully. Now for fiat, I guess the most important one is the fact that inflation is absolutely possible and is even part of the goal of a central bank. So they have a stated target of reducing the purchasing power of existing fiat money by at least 2% every year. So you're guaranteed to get devalued by at least 2% every year if the central bank meets its target, but usually it's more like 7 or 8% in developed countries, as I've previously talked about. So people control it as well, and it doesn't have egalitarian rules. If you want to understand more about this, look into the Cantillon effect. Now, just from looking at this, some of you might be thinking, but how can Bitcoin possibly be a store of value if it's so volatile? And my answer to that would be that if you want stability in your store of value or a lack of volatility in your store of value, then that's not a property of the store of value itself, but it's a consequence of the market or human behavior. It's similar to saying that you want the price of your store of value to go up 8 to 10% per year. That's not an inherent property that anything has. That's just a consequence of human behavior. And another thing that I would say about this is that, of course, anybody would expect stability in their store of value, but stability is the result of something already being an established store of value with the best store of value properties. You wouldn't expect that stability to happen while this store of value becomes an established store of value, because this requires broad adoption, liquidity, and market confidence, which will then reduce the volatility. Now, another thing that some of you might say is, well, but I want my store of value to have a cash flow. And that's also why a lot of people use property as a store of value. But my response to that would be that, as we say in the finance world, there is no free lunch. If an asset is paying you something, that yield has to come from somewhere. And yield is usually compensation for risk or for temporarily relinquishing control of your asset. A few examples of this are bank deposits and bonds, where you have currency inflation risk and you need to trust that the bank or government doesn't default. For a rental property, you have to manage the tenants, you have maintenance costs, and you have to abide by local regulations. Furthermore, a tenant could completely destroy your property as well. And there could be a lot of unexpected costs coming your way. For equity dividends, you rely on company performance and board decisions, and dividends can be cut at any time. Now, Bitcoin and gold are examples of pure stores of value, meaning they don't inherently produce yield just by existing. But a true store of value is sought because you don't want to rely on counterparties or external factors. You just want to hold an asset that simply preserves your economic energy over time without any additional complexities, contracts, or risk exposures that typically accompany yield. And when you think about it, this is really what saving is supposed to be. And gold used to fulfill this role. Now, one very big ethos that a lot of Bitcoiners emphasize all of the time is don't trust, verify. Don't take my word for everything that I just went through. Really think about, if I could design the most perfect store of value or the container of battery to store my economic energy, what properties would I give it? And it's probably helpful to think about disadvantages of current stores of value and what property a store of value would have that doesn't lead to this disadvantage. If you're currently using something to store your value and there's something about that store of value that bothers you, and think about, okay, what property would a store of value have so that I don't have this disadvantage? And if there's anything that you disagree with in the list that I just shared, or if you think that I forgot any key properties, please feel free to reach out to me in the comments. I would love to learn more about this and expand my list or improve my list as well. Now, before we move on to Bitcoin's role in a portfolio, there's one other insight from studying human history that I would like to share because it helps make sense of Bitcoin's place in the evolution of stores of value. And that is the evolution of problem solving. Now, we humans were problem solvers. That is how we have built advanced civilizations and progressed as far as we have. And the typical pattern that we follow is that we encounter a problem, we then initially misuse or repurpose existing solutions as the best available fix until someone comes along and engineers the perfect solution, which is actually made purely to address the problem. An example of this is that we can't see in the dark, and it would be beneficial to be able to see at night as well. Now, we initially misused or repurposed fire in different forms. We used actual fire, torches, and candles. But the problem is that each of those solutions was imperfect in and of itself. Fire creates a lot of smoke and can be very dangerous if it gets out of hand. Candles don't produce a lot of smoke, but they also don't produce a lot of light, and they're not that easily portable. Torches produce more light and are portable, but they're a bit more dangerous. They require oil and they're not as easy to put down in one place. So what people used to do in a castle, for example, if you think back a couple hundred years, is they would diversify or hedge amongst all of these imperfect solutions because they complement each other and are good in different scenarios. Until Edison, Tesla, and others developed electricity and the light bulb, and now over 99% of modern lighting is electric. Another example is that long-distance communication was slow and unreliable, and the repurposed solutions for that were things like smoke signals, horseback messengers, letters, even pigeons and telegrams as well, until someone engineered the internet and telecommunication networks, which is now the backbone of 90+% of global communication. Another example is that food spoils quickly in warm environments, and we needed to cool and preserve food. We initially misused salt by salting food. We were digging cellars and we used ice blocks for this until someone engineered the electric refrigerator, which is now the standard for 99% of modern food preservation. Now, really notice this pattern of us initially misusing or repurposing existing solutions as the best available fix until someone engineered the perfect solution, and then almost all of the energy that went into these repurposed solutions flowed into the perfect solution. Now, how does this relate to Bitcoin? If we think about one of the oldest problems that we've had, which is storing wealth in a way in which it maintains its purchasing power over time and ideally generations, then that is one of the oldest problems that we've encountered. Now, I've already talked about the evolution of money, where we saw that we initially misused everything from seashells to limestones to precious metals, to now misusing shares, property, gold, art, and other collectibles as the best available fix. But we also saw that all of these solutions are imperfect in and of themselves. And if you really think about it, we're just misappropriating these assets. Property, for example, is primarily for living or commercial use, but many people now treat it as a store of wealth. But you've got problems of illiquidity, taxes, maintenance, and regulation. Shares are ideally just a fractional ownership in a productive enterprise, and a company can fail, it can dilute its shares, and the share price can be volatile and subject to market cycles as well. Now, art and collectibles, here the valuations are subjective, they're very illiquid, and they're also tied to fashion and cultural preferences. Now, gold is probably by far the closest to a purpose-built monetary asset historically, but it has a lot of problems that we previously discussed. Now, at the moment, people diversify amongst these solutions, but as we saw previously in the comparison of the properties of an ideal store of value, there is a very good argument that now someone has come along, namely Satoshi, and engineered the perfect solution to storing value. And if we think back at the pattern that we saw previously, where once the most perfect solution was engineered, 99% of the energy and time that flowed into the diversified solution of repurposed existing solutions flowed into the perfect engineered solution. What if something similar happens with storing value? Now, I'm not saying that Bitcoin is necessarily going to suck up 90+% of all of the wealth that's currently stored in these repurposed solutions. But what if we're conservative and we say maybe it's able to take up 10% of that, what would that look like? If we actually look at the total addressable market for storing value and list all of the different assets for that with their total market cap or total addressable market. Now, these numbers are a bit outdated because the gold market cap is around 17 or 18 trillion at the moment, but the logic remains the same, so just bear with me. If we sum all of that up, that's roughly 900 trillion US dollars. And if we assume that around 50% of that represents monetary premium or store value function, that gives us a total addressable market of 450 trillion US dollars. And if 10% of that flowed into Bitcoin, that would be $2.14 million per Bitcoin. Now, the way that the person whom I got this table from did this is they looked at the potential Bitcoin market capture of each of these different assets and then did a bottom-up calculation, and they actually got to roughly $10 million per Bitcoin. But you could do something like this and make your own assumptions for Bitcoin's capture of an existing store of value and come up with your own estimate for what Bitcoin price that would be down here. Now, interestingly enough, in early 2022, so roughly 3 years ago, ARK Invest did something very similar where they looked at different use cases for Bitcoin. For example, a remittance network, and then they looked at what percentage of that use case could be captured by Bitcoin. And for the remittance network, they assumed 50%, but there's other things like nation-state treasury, 1% of total reserves, seizure-resistant assets, 5% of global high net worth individual wealth, corporate treasuries, digital gold, 50% of that. And they then did a bottom-up calculation as well and got to 1.36 million per Bitcoin by the year 2030. Now, even if Bitcoin only competes with gold and replaces it as the dominant sovereign store of value or breaks even with the current market cap, then we could see roughly a 9x from here, which gets us to 850,000 per Bitcoin. So that's if Bitcoin only competes with gold. Now, this might even seem a bit extreme to some of you, and you might say, but gold has such a long history, central banks have held it for forever, and we've got 5,000 years of gold being used as a store of value. I'm not sure if Bitcoin will actually do that. Let's actually look at two charts that show how much interest there's in Bitcoin, especially in the institutional and investment space compared to gold. Now, this chart here compares the assets under management of the ETFs for BlackRock, for Bitcoin, and for gold. Now, as you can see, the gold ETF, it launched in 2004, and it took 20 years for that to accumulate $33 billion in assets under management. The Bitcoin ETF, on the other hand, launched 1 year ago and managed to accumulate almost double the assets under management. I mean, just comparing these two charts really speaks for itself. Another interesting chart of looking at Bitcoin as a competitor to gold is looking at the total ETF inflows by year. Now, the numbers for gold, which are in black here, are inflation adjusted, so this becomes really comparable. And an interesting thing that you can see here is that for gold, after each year after the launch, so year one of the ETFs, there were higher and higher inflows until we reached a really high peak in year 6. But even year 7, 8, and 9 had higher inflows than in year 5. Now, if you just look at year 1 of the Bitcoin ETFs versus the gold ETFs, that's already a massive difference. I mean, it's a different world. But just imagine if something similar happens to the Bitcoin ETFs that happened to the gold ETFs, where each following year after 2024, there's higher and higher inflows into the ETFs, and then at some point there's really, really big inflows. Just imagine what would happen to the Bitcoin price if that happens. Okay, now that we've covered that, let's look at the adoption trajectory of Bitcoin to understand where we currently are. Now, one thing that I want to explain here quickly is something called Gartner hype cycles. This is how a lot of technologies get adopted. And basically what this curve here shows is that there's usually a new technology that comes along, which is this trigger here. Then there's a peak of inflated expectations. So what happens is that initially people with really strong conviction about the transformative nature of the new technology buy that technology until the supply of new participants reachable in this cycle is exhausted. And then just before we reach the peak, the buying becomes dominated by speculators interested in quick profits, which then at some point, because there's a lot of speculation, leads to a rapid price drop and a sense that the technology wasn't transformative at all. But throughout this whole process, there is a new cohort of people that learned about this technology and developed a really strong conviction until we get to this trough of disillusionment here, where public interest dwindles, and then through this slope of enlightenment, a new, stable, boring low is formed until we reach the next iteration of the cycle. Now, why do I mention this? Because Bitcoin's price pattern actually appears to follow a fractal pattern of increasing magnitude of exactly these Gartner hype cycles, where each iteration of the fractal matches the classic shape of this. And how we can see this is if we look at the Bitcoin chart not on a linear scale, but on a log scale. Now, why do we do this? A lot of scientists will easily understand this, but basically a linear scale, which is the one in the gray line here, which is the Bitcoin chart that you're probably used to looking at, a linear scale shows absolute price changes, meaning that for price history that spans many orders of magnitude, such as the one that Bitcoin has, the biggest order of magnitude, which is the one that we're currently in, will overshadow early periods of growth and make it difficult to see any long-term trends. A log scale, on the other hand, reveals growth trends and highlights percentage-based changes rather than absolute price jumps, meaning that a jump from $100, so for the log scale, the y-axis on the right here, so jump from $100 to $1,000 appears visually similar to a jump from 10,000 to 100,000. Both are a 10x, so they should look the same if you want to be able to identify any patterns in this. This is also why, for example, the bull market here in early 2014, which had percentage-wise the biggest price increases, this was absolutely insane, looks like only a small blip here, because we've now moved on to so much higher orders of magnitude that you can barely even see this on the linear scale. But if you look at the log scale and the percentage change, you can see that roughly within 2 months, the price went from $100 to $1,000. So 10x within 2 months. That would be equivalent to us now going from 100,000 to 1 million by March of 2025. And when you look at the Bitcoin price in a log chart, you can also see the pattern of repeating bull and bear markets. It becomes really clear that we do follow something like this Gartner hype cycle, where you have a bull market, followed by a bear market, followed by another bull market, and another bear market, and another bull market, and another bear market, and then we most likely currently are in the middle of a bull market. Okay. Looking at the adoption trajectory and comparing that to other technologies that we've seen, like the internet and mobile phones, is also really interesting, because this here is from BlackRock. It looks like this is the crypto adoption in general, is potentially outpacing other transformative technologies like the internet or the mobile phone. As you can see, the yellow line here for crypto is moving faster than the blue line for mobile phones, which was also moving faster than the green line for the internet. Now, if you compare Bitcoin adoption to the internet adoption, now this only goes up until 2023, but if we extrapolate that out, we're probably somewhere around 2000 or 2001 in terms of the internet adoption, where we currently are with the Bitcoin adoption. And as you can also see here, Bitcoin's adoption seems to be outpacing internet adoption, but it also shows how early we still are in the adoption of Bitcoin. Now, another thing to note here is that there's approximately somewhere between 800 million and 1 billion active wallets globally, and this is estimated to be somewhere around 400 million unique users of Bitcoin. Now, what does that mean? If we have a total addressable market of 4 to 5 billion people worldwide with access to the internet, smartphones, and a need for digital, censorship-resistant, global decentralized store of value and payment system, then the 400 million current adopters represent 8 to 10% of that adoption. And if we look at the typical S-shaped technology adoption pattern, which we've seen for a lot of other technologies, like the refrigerator, like electricity, the radio, the dishwasher, the computer, air conditioning, and so on, that would put us somewhere here in the adoption curve, meaning we're still in the early adopters phase and we're still at a point right before this adoption curve is about to take off. If we put this on a bell curve, you can also see that where we currently are is what's called the visionaries part of the early market, and it looks like we could be about to cross what's called the chasm, which is where you move from the early market to the mainstream market, and this is usually where adoption really starts to take off. But it just shows how early in the adoption trajectory of a new technology we still are with Bitcoin. And I know a lot of people will look at the price and say, wow, we're already at $100,000, but we're still very, very early. And based on the recent developments in the institutional space and government adoption and so on, it feels like we could be close to crossing the chasm here, which would be a really good opportunity. Now let's look at Bitcoin's role in a portfolio. Now, one thing that's really important to mention here is that, first of all, this is not investment advice. This is for educational purposes only. I'm not an investment advisor, but if you were to look at Bitcoin and how you could put a small percentage allocation to Bitcoin in a portfolio and what impact that would have on an investment portfolio, then these slides here will be helpful. Now, Bitcoin's best case in a portfolio, along with other things, is as a unique diversifier. The two charts that I'm showing here are, first of all, the trailing 6-month correlation with the S&P 500 between Bitcoin and gold, and the trailing 1-year correlation of Bitcoin versus the S&P 500, gold, and bonds. So let's look at Bitcoin and gold versus the S&P 500. As you can see, for both Bitcoin and gold, there's not one clear pattern of the correlation to the S&P, so to equities. And the average correlation for Bitcoin is roughly 0.1, and for gold it's around 0. So both Bitcoin and gold on average are really uncorrelated to the S&P 500 or to equities in general. Meaning that if you put gold or Bitcoin in your portfolio, you can get excess returns, but because it's uncorrelated to the rest of the assets, especially if you hold a lot of equities in your portfolio, that might not increase the volatility of your portfolio that much. I'll explain this a little bit more in a second. Now, if you look at Bitcoin versus the S&P, gold and bonds, you can also see that it's pretty uncorrelated with a lot of those assets, and Bitcoin is most correlated with gold and equities, and it moves through different phases. Sometimes it's negatively correlated, sometimes it's very uncorrelated, and sometimes it's more positively correlated. Now, one thing that you can see is that recently Bitcoin has been more correlated with equities and also more correlated with gold. Now, why is this the case? I think you would expect this because Bitcoin, as a global decentralized fixed supply non-sovereign asset, has distinct risk and return drivers compared to any traditional asset class, and it should be fundamentally uncorrelated in the long term. Now, short-term market behavior can occasionally diverge from this, as we've seen recently because of all the institutional and Wall Street adoption of Bitcoin, which probably puts it more in the same bracket as equities and risk assets for those types of investors. But over the long run, Bitcoin's adoption drivers are likely to be distinct from or even inverted with global macro factors that drive more traditional finance assets. Now, if you look at something like the typical 60-40 portfolio where you have 60% in equities and 40% in bonds. Now, in this case, I'm using the MSCI World for equities and a Bloomberg Global Aggregate Bond Index for bonds. And if you add 1%, 2%, or 3% of Bitcoin into that portfolio, and here I'm always taking it out of the MSCI World part of the portfolio and keeping bonds at 40% to only shift from one risk asset, so equities, to another risk asset, Bitcoin. Let's look at what that actually does to the return and volatility of a 60-40 portfolio. So for return, as you can see, as you add more Bitcoin, the historical return of that portfolio would have gone up. Makes a lot of sense because Bitcoin has been the best performing asset over the past decade. But what's really interesting about this is that at the same time, the volatility of this portfolio barely moves. It basically stays almost the same, which means that the Sharpe ratio, which in finance is a measure of the return per unit of risk, only goes up as you add more Bitcoin to the portfolio, and the maximum drawdown, so how much that portfolio would have gone down at any point in time, and the maximum of that only goes up a little bit by adding 3% into Bitcoin as well. Now, another way that you could think about this is if you use a risk budgeting approach, then the allocation can be based on how much it would contribute to overall portfolio risk. If you look at it from that perspective, and we're looking at a 1, 2, 3, and 4% allocation to Bitcoin, you can see that as you add more Bitcoin to this 60-40 portfolio, it quickly starts to take over a big share of the overall portfolio risk. At 1%, it's only 1.9% of the total portfolio risk, but at 4%, it's already taking up 16% of the risk of volatility of your whole portfolio. Now, an interesting comparison to this, though, is that the Magnificent Seven all roughly have 2.5 trillion US dollars of market cap on average, which is similar to Bitcoin at the moment, and they make up roughly 1/5 of the entire MSCI world because they've become so big and account for roughly 4% of overall portfolio risk on average in a 60-40 portfolio, meaning that each of the Magnificent Seven stocks, if you hold a 60-40 portfolio, because they make up such a big part of the MSCI world and because they tend to be somewhat volatile, they account for 4% of overall portfolio risk. What that means then is, and this is the really interesting point here, is that somewhere between 1 to 2% allocation to Bitcoin adds a similar amount of risk to a 60-40 portfolio as the average Magnificent Seven stock contributes, but it provides a diverse source of risk, as we saw here. So when you put it that way, it looks a bit different, but up for you to decide what you make with that information. Now that we've talked about Bitcoin in a portfolio and its role as a unique diversifier, let's compare Bitcoin and crypto. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm basically using Ethereum to generalize for all of crypto, just because it's easy to make a comparison between Bitcoin and Ethereum. Ethereum also is the second biggest crypto asset, and I think a lot of the points that are different to Bitcoin about Ethereum will be generalizable to the rest of crypto as well. So if we go through all of these here, so the value proposition, Bitcoin is supposed to be an internet native global monetary alternative or store of value, but Ethereum is trying to be a programmable platform for decentralized applications. Now, looking at the speed of improvement implementations on Bitcoin versus Ethereum, Bitcoin is slow and deliberate, but it's slow and deliberate on purpose because it tries to prioritize security and stability. Bitcoin was designed to do one thing and one thing only, and the core of the protocol is set in stone. So we actually don't want to make any fast changes or many changes, and we only want to do them if they're really required, and usually they're only small improvements to it, but the core of the Bitcoin protocol won't change. For Ethereum, there's really fast and more responsive changes that happen here. Now, one of the key points of comparison here is the level of decentralization. Bitcoin is really, really decentralized, and Ethereum, on the other hand, is quite centralized. Now, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but Ethereum had a pre-mine of somewhere around 70%, meaning that the people that created Ethereum and the people that were involved with that gave themselves around 70% of the Ethereum before they launched it. And roughly 60% of that is still in the hands of the foundation and Vitalik and people close to the foundation, which basically has centralized control over the network. Another thing that's important to consider, and that's related to the level of decentralization, is that proof of stake, which is the consensus mechanism for Ethereum, is inherently centralizing, as it gives more power to those who already hold a lot of the underlying tokens. This is not the case for Bitcoin because it uses proof of work, and in Bitcoin, if you have 500,000 Bitcoin, that doesn't give you more influence over the consensus mechanism and the network or the protocol than having 1 Bitcoin or 0.1 Bitcoin. Now, the monetary policy for Bitcoin, it's fixed, pre-programmed, and has never changed. For Ethereum, it has changed 3 times since 2021 and is expected to change again. Bitcoin, as I've said previously, is really easy to audit for anyone at any time. And Ethereum technically can be audited, but it's much more difficult. It's really complex because of smart contracts, dynamic supply activities, and a broad range of on-chain activity. If you want to compare it to anything in traditional finance, for Bitcoin, the best comparison is probably gold or maybe alternatives. And for Ethereum, it might be venture capital and early stage tech startups. Now, don't just take my word for it. This here is a photo from a presentation that BlackRock gave to some high net worth individuals and institutional investors, I think in October last year, where they also clearly distinguish between Bitcoin and Ethereum. And here they also mentioned that Bitcoin's thesis is a global monetary alternative. They classify it as a risk off and compared to gold and alternatives. And Ethereum, in their opinion, is really a bet on blockchain adoption. It's risk on and comparable to equities and venture capital. Now, one thing I want to highlight here is that distinguishing between Bitcoin and crypto is really important because they represent fundamentally different investments. Apart from the fact that they both use blockchain and cryptography, Bitcoin and crypto have nothing in common and are completely different. I really want you to understand this because it's so important, and a lot of people in the crypto space try to attach themselves to Bitcoin or say that they are an improved version of Bitcoin, but they really try to do something completely different and are different asset classes. Another thing that's important to note is that crypto is facing a lot of competition between altcoins or alternative projects or tokens who all try to do similar things, but to Bitcoin there really isn't any competitor. Another thing that's important to understand is that blockchain technology in and of itself isn't even great technology. It's a really inefficient way to do a database. And it took me a very long time to understand this, but Satoshi didn't implement Bitcoin using the blockchain because it's such good tech. He used it despite it being pretty bad tech because it was the only way to make a truly decentralized, trustless money work. Really important to understand. All right, with the comparison of Bitcoin and crypto, or Ethereum in this case, out of the way, I would like to take some time to talk about some of the common questions and concerns that we've been hearing in the Bitcoin space for a long time. Now, before I move on to the actual questions, one of the things that I want to highlight is that it is expected that there will be FUD, which stands for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I've included a few examples of when this happened previously. This here is a newspaper article from December 2000 that says the internet may just be a passing fad as millions give up on it. This here is actually an anti-electricity propaganda cartoon from 1889 when electricity was a recent innovation that really demonized electricity. Now, here are 2 really interesting quotes. One is from King William of Prussia. When he heard about the invention of trains at the time, he said, "No one will pay good money to get from Berlin to Potsdam in 1 hour when he can ride his horse there in 1 day for free." And Sir William Preece, chief engineer of the British Post Office at the time, said, "The Americans have need of the telephone, but we do not. We have plenty of messenger boys." Now, obviously, these were all completely incorrect with the benefit of hindsight, but why I'm showing these is that this FUD, this fear, uncertainty, and doubt often comes from people who aren't experts in the fields that are required to understand the invention that they are talking about, or they have an interest in protecting their industry, which is threatened by the invention. Think about Sir William Preece here. And because they're perceived as some kind of authority in another field, we attribute some level of insight to what they have to say, failing to understand that their level of expertise doesn't just translate from their field onto the new field. And listening to these people talk about the internet here, for example, is kind of like listening to the experts on fax machines and the post office when the internet was invented, instead of listening to the computer nerds, programmers, and network specialists at the time. But the problem with FUD is that we humans have a psychological bias to anchor to first impressions. This is why our parents tell us from a very young age that first impressions matter so much. When you go on a first date, you try to make the best first impression. When you have a job interview, you try to make the best first impression that you can, because we know that a bad first impression is really hard to overcome. And unfortunately, most of our first impressions of Bitcoin are likely from 2017, or maybe from the last bull market in 2020, 2021, where there was a lot of media FUD, like Bitcoin is a Ponzi scheme, it's money for criminals, or even Bitcoin mining is boiling the oceans. Now, all of us have this psychological bias. We can't get rid of them, but we can be aware of them. This doesn't mean that there aren't maybe some legitimate concerns about Bitcoin, but most of the concerns that we hear repeated over and over again have been disproven credibly dozens of times since 2017, but we still hear them. So here are some of them. Now, the first one is Bitcoin's energy use and the impact on the climate, especially as we now live in a world where ESG has become really important and companies and countries and governments are paying more attention to this. Now, it's difficult to come across estimates of this, but the best estimates that I found for the share of sustainable energy that actually goes into Bitcoin mining is the following chart here. Now, this only goes up to January 2024, and I've seen reliable estimates that this is potentially a little bit higher now, but as of January 2024, Bitcoin mining's share of sustainable energy was roughly at 54 to 55%. Now, here's a rough breakdown of what that looks like. So the biggest portion of that comes from hydro energy. Wind and nuclear also play a big role. Solar is also roughly 5% of that. And then we have other renewables that are being used for this as well. Now, what does 54.5% mean? How does that compare to other industries? If we compare Bitcoin mining and just say it's 50+%, to other industries like the banking sector, which uses 39%, or the industrial sector, which has 32% share of renewable energy, agricultural sector 19%, gold mining 13%, or in my case, because I'm living in Australia, Australia as a country 39% share of renewable energy. Now, you might look at that and wonder, wow, why is Bitcoin mining's share of renewables so high compared to all other industries? And my response to that would be that there's probably two main drivers behind this. The first one is the economic incentives. Mining is extremely competitive, which leads miners to seek out the cheapest electricity that they can find, which usually ends up being abundant renewable energy sources in Iceland, Canada, Scandinavia, or even Africa. Another reason for this high share of renewables is the flexibility that Bitcoin miners have. Bitcoin mining operations are relatively flexible and movable compared to other consumers of electricity, so they can constantly move where the energy is most abundant and cheapest, which, as I said, tends to be abundant renewable energy. And then another key aspect, and this is really, really important to understand, is that the load of Bitcoin mining itself is highly flexible and can help balance grids, especially renewable grids, because you can turn Bitcoin mining on and off with the flick of a button. Now, some of you might say, okay, well, that's good. I mean, Bitcoin has a better share of renewables than other industries, but Bitcoin doesn't produce anything. At least the other industries, like the industrial sector, they produce goods. Agricultural sector produces food that we use, but Bitcoin doesn't produce anything. I would say that also misses the point, because security and verifiable digital scarcity are valuable outputs in and of themselves, just as intangible as the product of electronic banking or the internet backbone. Which brings me to another point, which is very similar to what I just said, which is another criticism that says Bitcoin has no use case, similar to Bitcoin doesn't produce anything. There are a lot of use cases for this, but people like me living in Australia or in Europe or in the US or other developed countries often fail to really see the use case because of our financial privilege. But one very recent example, and one that I've heard stories about personally because I'm from Germany, and Germany took in a lot of refugees from Ukraine after the conflict with Russia escalated, is that a lot of those Ukrainians, when they fled Ukraine to come to Germany or other European countries, couldn't take a lot of their belongings with them, or let alone their property, which they had a lot of money invested into. And what happened in Ukraine as well is that the government implemented a law overnight that limited cash withdrawals from the bank to 20 euros per day, meaning that they were trying to stop Ukrainians withdrawing all of their money from the bank and fleeing the country with their money. But there's a lot of Ukrainians that had Bitcoin when the conflict escalated already, and that were able to flee Ukraine and take a lot of their wealth with them thanks to Bitcoin. Now with gold, that could have been confiscated, cash they couldn't withdraw from the bank, and their house or property, it's immobile and they couldn't take that with them either. But Bitcoin, they could take with them, and a lot of them have come to Germany and were able to rebuild and start from scratch and buy a house, or at least pay for the rent, and start a new life thanks to having Bitcoin. One thing we can see on the right here is the grassroots crypto adoption of different countries. You can see that the country with the most adoption is India, then we have Nigeria, Vietnam, the US is actually pretty high, Ukraine, which I just spoke about, is number 5, China, Russia, the UK. So you can see a lot of these countries might be countries where they are not as financially privileged as we in the Western or developed countries are. Now, Bitcoin also accounts for a large percentage of global remittances, and people in countries with dysfunctional or tyrannical governments don't have bank accounts. And oftentimes not because there are no banks, but because they don't trust them. Bitcoin and stablecoins help them overcome this, and also help them protect their savings from hyperinflation or bypass strict capital controls that those countries might have. Now, as I already said, I think for a lot of us the problem is that our financial privilege and the fact that we live in a somewhat functioning financial system blinds us to a lot of these use cases, but they certainly exist, and there are billions of people all over the world who don't enjoy this privilege, and to them something like Bitcoin, or I guess also stablecoin for medium of exchange, is really a lifesaver. And I think we shouldn't dismiss that just because we don't personally have that same use case for it at the moment. Another thing that I want to say here is that storing value is the largest use case and addressable market in the world. We talked about this previously already, but that's 450 or more trillion US dollars. So I would argue that not only are there many use cases for many people all over the world, but it's also the biggest use case in the world. Combining all of that into an ESG lens, if we look at the different components of ESG, the environmental component, yes, Bitcoin uses a lot of electricity, but it's coming increasingly from renewables. It can subsidize renewable energy projects, which is a really cool aspect. I'll probably record another video to explain what this means further. It can also be used to stabilize energy grids, such as Texas is already doing in the US, and it monetizes stranded or abundant energy. In terms of the social aspect, it fosters financial inclusion and human rights, and especially for emerging markets where people mistrust their banks and governments or don't have access to banking services. This is really important. The governance of Bitcoin is based on transparency and fairness. They're both key building blocks of the protocol and idea behind Bitcoin, and the governance is also open source and community driven. Now, another criticism that we often hear is that Bitcoin is used for criminal activity. This chart here on the left is from Chainalysis. It only goes up to 2021, but I would assume the numbers to be similar, potentially even lower nowadays. And as you can see, only around 0.15% of all cryptocurrency transaction volume was actually used for some type of criminal activity. Now, what's interesting is that according to the UN, roughly 2 to 5% of fiat, especially cash, which is worth somewhere between 800 billion to 2 trillion US dollars, was associated with some type of illicit activity in 1 year as well. So compared to 2 to 5% for fiat money, 0.15% for cryptocurrencies is really low. Now you might ask yourself, but why is Bitcoin barely used for any illicit or illegal activities compared to fiat money? I've been hearing that, because Bitcoin is like kind of anonymous, pseudonymous is what we call it, it's good to be used for that. And the reason for that actually is that, as I said previously, Bitcoin's ledger is immutable and completely transparent, which also means that its transaction history can be tracked into eternity. So criminals who know what they're doing would be very ill-advised to use this protocol for illicit activity. Another thing that's really important to understand here is that the Bitcoin network itself is neutral. It just provides the infrastructure to transfer value in a decentralized, trustless way globally. Kind of like how roads are neutral as well. They are just infrastructure to get us from A to B and to drive cars from A to B. But a certain percentage of road traffic will be criminals conducting illicit activities. But that doesn't mean that roads in and of themselves are bad, but they can be used by people conducting illicit activity. One other thing that I want to highlight here, and this is not to demonize banks, this is just objectively observing and comparing the crypto space or the Bitcoin space to banks. What we've got on the right here is a list of the top 10 banks that were penalized for some sort of fraud, tax evasion, investor protection violation, banking violation, money laundering, etc. and the total penalty and the criminal records that they received for that. And since the year 2000, banks have been fined over 7,400 times globally for all of these crimes, resulting in fines worth more than 381 billion US dollars, which is currently roughly 1/5 of the total Bitcoin market cap, just to put that into perspective. Another criticism is that Bitcoin is too volatile. I've already addressed this a little bit earlier, but I want to address this again, and I want to start this with a thought experiment. So imagine you didn't know about Bitcoin, and someone came along and told you that there's going to be this new type of internet money that's going to be created by some anonymous person on the internet. Nobody knows who he is. It's initially only going to be used by a small group of cypherpunks and computer nerds, and it's slowly going to spread as this bottom-up movement. And initially it'll be worth fractions of a cent, but within 25 to 30 years, each unit of that new currency will go from fractions of a cent to millions of dollars. And along the way, there will be wars, a global pandemic, financial crises, governments all over the world will try to ban it, central banks will try to fight it, people won't really know what it is. Given all of this information, if you now had to describe what the path or the evolution from fractions of a cent to millions of dollars within 25 to 30 years looks like, how would you describe it? And I think we can all agree that we would probably say, wow, that would probably be a really volatile path. So assuming that Bitcoin is really fulfilling its potential and becoming what it promises to become, it's behaving exactly as you would expect it to behave. Now, another few arguments for why it's so volatile at the moment is that it trades 24/7, 365 days per year. It's the most responsive asset to geopolitical and economic events, regardless of whether they happen overnight or on the weekend. The volatility is likely also a consequence of its perfectly inelastic supply, meaning that a rise in demand cannot increase the supply or issuance speed, which is unlike any other good or commodity. And this is also what makes Bitcoin scarce and valuable. Bitcoin also tends to be traded with leverage, and there tends to be a lot of speculation that builds up during bull markets, which increases volatility as well. And Bitcoin, as I already said previously, is still a new asset and early in the adoption cycle. And you would expect that the volatility goes down as the adoption continues and as it approaches a more stable stage of being an accepted store of value. Which, if we look at the volatility over time, compared to the Bitcoin price, so the Bitcoin price is here in orange and the 1 year rolling volatility is in yellow. You can see that over time, especially recently, volatility has gone down more and more, and I would expect this to continue into the future. Now, another criticism is Bitcoin has failed as a medium of exchange because I can't buy my coffee with it. Some people even say that Bitcoin hasn't fulfilled Satoshi's vision of becoming a peer-to-peer electronic cash. And they will also say that other crypto assets like Solana or XRP or whatever else will fulfill this role because they can actually handle the transaction volume required to be a global payment system. My first response to that would be, as we've covered earlier already, an asset that moves through the stages of monetization and becomes a monetary good needs to be a stable store of value before it becomes a medium of exchange. So we would expect it to not fulfill the medium of exchange role on a global scale at this point yet, because we're not at that stage in the monetization phase yet. And in other words, when you think about this, in order to really become a decentralized version of Visa, beneath that you must first create a decentralized version of Fedwire, which is what's currently the base layer of the legacy financial system. And along with that, you must first create a decentralized version of digital gold. Now, if we look at layered financial systems and compare the legacy financial system to the Bitcoin financial system, let's actually do that comparison. Let's look at the legacy financial system first and go from the top to the bottom here. As we can see, the first layer is basically the layer that we do all of our everyday transactions in. And they're instantaneous. We use Visa, MasterCard, Amex, PayPal, and so on to transact instantaneously. And the transactions happen instantaneously, but they actually don't settle straight away. Usually what happens is that after each business day, transactions are batched together by the payment processor and sent through an interbank clearing process. This is where banks calculate net amounts owed to one another, and they then net out the difference. So basically what happens is, if I transfer money to you via bank transfer, that money doesn't instantly and finally arrive in your account, but my bank keeps track of that money sent to your bank, and your bank keeps track of how much money was sent from your bank to my bank. And then at the end of the day, they have a total of how much was exchanged by customers between the two banks, and then they net out the difference. Now, at the base of this layered financial system is what's called the Fedwire system, to which only banks and certain financial institutions have direct access to. And this system ensures finality at the ultimate ledger of central bank reserves. It's the bank's balances at the Federal Reserve, in the US at least, if you will. But how would something like this work in the Bitcoin system? So starting from the bottom and going up to the top, the Bitcoin blockchain in the Bitcoin layered financial system would be the main layer, similar to Fedwire in the current legacy financial system, where transactions have high security, immutability, and settlement finality. Like Fedwire, it's not practical for billions of daily coffee purchases to settle on the base chain because each block has limited space and fees can fluctuate. The Lightning Network is what we call, The Lightning Network is what we call a payment channel solution, which is built on top of the base layer of Bitcoin. Users essentially lock some Bitcoin in a channel on the base blockchain and can then transact instantly and continuously off-chain with near zero fees. Millions of times, just stay within the Lightning Network, back and forth, that all works. Only when they're done using that channel or want to rebalance, they publish a final channel state back to the blockchain, which is effectively like net settling between the banks. Like a credit card swipe, Lightning payments are confirmed within milliseconds. So the instantaneous payment that we're used to from using our Visa, MasterCard or other credit cards is achievable with the Lightning Network as well. And merchants can accept Lightning as cash final, since it's cryptographically enforced off-chain, even if the final settlement happens later. By moving transactions to Lightning channels, the Bitcoin base layer remains secure and decentralized, while day-to-day payments happen quickly and cheaply at higher layers. So, in essence, if you understand that our current financial system is also using a layered financial system, and that we could implement the same infrastructure, or technically it's implemented already using a Bitcoin financial system, then in essence saying that Bitcoin failed as a medium of exchange because you can't buy your coffee with it is like saying, well, the dollar has failed because I can't use FedWire to pay for my coffee. At some point, it'll likely be this type of scenario where Bitcoin is only used as a base layer for big settlements, for interbank settlements, maybe even at central bank level. And most people will do all of their transactions on the Lightning Network, which then regularly gets settled back to the Bitcoin main layer. And through that, the Lightning Network benefits from the absolute scarcity and the high security and immutability of the Bitcoin blockchain while being able to scale all over the world. All right, that brings me to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. Just write in the comments below. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll probably be publishing a few additional videos that go deeper into some of the topics that I covered in this video. Once again, remember, this isn't financial advice. If you find this really interesting as an educational video, you can now make your own investment decisions based on this, or at least educate yourself a little bit further. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.